The chamber was heavy with the kind of silence that comes before a storm, a silence filled with restless cameras, clicking and muted whispers from the gallery. Then, like a thunderclap cutting through calm skies, Barron Trump's words rang out, sharp and dismissive. Jasmine Crockett is unfit. The insult was not just thrown, it was flung with the casual arrogance of someone certain the room already belonged to him. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Crockett's eyes held steady, but the air around her trembled with shock. Gasps rippled through the crowd, some covering their mouths, others shaking their heads in disbelief. It wasn't just an attack on her, it was an attack on every woman who had ever been told she didn't belong, every immigrant family who had been told their place in America was conditional, every voice dismissed by those drunk on entitlement. The cameras caught every angle, Barron leaning back with a smirk, convinced he had landed a fatal blow. Crockett poised in silence, her composure a shield sharper than any words she could hurl back in the moment. The insult seemed designed to pierce her dignity, to reduce her to a caricature of weakness, but beneath the surface, the insult had sparked something very different. Across the country, televisions flickered as Americans watched, wide-eyed, mouths agape. On social media, the clip spread instantly, captions in all caps, "Unfit?" Outrage bled into disbelief. Could he really have said it so brazenly, so unapologetically in front of the entire nation? For those watching, it wasn't just political theater anymore. It was personal. Every second stretched, and the silence grew louder than the insult itself. In that silence, the world waited. Would she shrink? Would she break? Would she fire back in anger and prove him right? Or would she somehow transform this ambush into something unforgettable? Jasmine Crockett lifted her chin ever so slightly. Her eyes narrowed, not with fury but with clarity. She didn't need to answer right away. Because what she held in her hand, what no one yet knew, would turn this insult on its head. And as Barron's smirk widened, oblivious to what was coming, the audience leaned closer, sensing a storm building. They didn't know it yet, but the word unfit was about to be buried forever, because no one was ready for the recording she would reveal. To understand why Barron Trump's insult cut so deep, you have to know who Jasmine Crockett is, and why this stage mattered more than most. She wasn't some nameless politician tossed into the spotlight by chance. She was a lawyer, a fighter, a freshman congresswoman who had carved her way into national politics through grit and a relentless refusal to be silenced. She represented voices too often left unheard. Immigrant families, working mothers, the communities that built America brick by brick, only to be told they were second class. This was not just another committee hearing. It was a stage where the nation tuned in to witness the clash of two very different visions of America. The insult wasn't just an attack on one woman's credibility. It carried centuries of echoes. The old narrative that women, particularly women of color, were unfit to lead, unfit to stand equal in halls of power, unfit to speak truth to privilege. Barron may have been just one voice in the room, but his words traveled far beyond those walls, hitting nerves that have been raw for generations. For the millions who had fought for the right to be recognized as fully American, fully worthy, his casual dismissal felt like a knife twisted with entitlement. Cameras captured every detail, the polished oak of the hearing table, the flags draped in silent witness, the stone-faced staffers trying not to react. It was the kind of stage where reputations are either cemented or shattered. Barron's insult was meant to cement his dominance, to freeze Crockett as a symbol of inadequacy. Instead, it threatened to ignite something much bigger. Across living rooms, office spaces, and crowded subway cars, Americans watched the clip again and again. For many, it felt personal. Women who had been talked over in boardrooms, immigrants who had been told to go back, students who had been told they weren't leadership material. They all recognized the tone, the smirk, the attempt. to strip someone of legitimacy with a single word. Barron wasn't just dismissing Crockett. He was dismissing them. And the question rose louder than the hearing itself. If this stands unchallenged, what does it say about America? If someone can declare another human being unfit simply because it suits their privilege, then what does leadership mean? What does democracy mean? What does the American dream mean to those who still believe in its promise? The weight of that moment was immense, because Crockett's silence after the insult wasn't weakness. It was calculation. She didn't snap back immediately. She didn't trade insult for insult. Instead, she let the words hang in the air long enough for the country to feel their sting. And then, while Barron basked in his own bravado, she prepared to do something far more devastating than respond in anger, because Crockett wasn't just armed with dignity, she was armed with evidence. Evidence that would take the word unfit and fling it back across the table with such force that it couldn't be ignored. Evidence that would make Americans sit up in their chairs and say, "Wait, did that just happen?" The nation thought they had tuned in for another clash of egos, another partisan exchange destined to fade by tomorrow's news cycle. But Jasmine Crockett was about to ensure that this moment lived far longer than a headline. The response she had prepared was unlike anything ever seen before. Barron Trump did not step onto the stage as an unknown figure. His very name carried the weight of privilege and the shadow of one of the most polarizing dynasties in American politics. From childhood, he had lived in a world where velvet ropes parted and doors opened without question. Cameras followed, but so did insulation, a cocoon of wealth, of yes men, of carefully curated moments that ensured he never had to face the sharp edges of accountability. For years, his public image had been just that, polished, untouchable, aloof. But privilege does more than shield. It shapes. And what it shaped in Barron was not humility or a sense of duty, but a certain entitlement. The belief that the world would bend simply because he was present. The belief that power was inherited, not earned. That credibility could be demanded, not proven. His father had once made a brand out of combative politics, attacking opponents with nicknames, insults, and relentless bravado. It was a style less about persuasion and more about domination. And Barron, knowingly or not, absorbed that playbook like a script written for his own rise. When he walked into that committee room, it was with the same swagger the world had seen, from his father countless times before. The smirk that suggested he already knew the outcome, the dismissive wave of a hand, the sharpened tone that cut before it reasoned. For him, calling Jasmine Crockett unfit wasn't a slip of the tongue or a moment of misplaced heat. It was strategy, learned behavior passed down like an heirloom. Discredit first, dehumanize second, dominate always. And for a time, that strategy worked. His persona was built on the assumption that criticism slid off him like water off marble. He could say what he pleased, confident that no one would dare challenge the Trump name with equal ferocity. Supporters cheered his bluntness, mistaking arrogance for strength. Detractors fumed, but their outrage only amplified his platform. In this carefully constructed cycle, Barron always came out untouched, his confidence solidified by the illusion of immunity. Yet beneath the surface, cracks had already begun to show. Privilege, after all, has a way of breeding blind spots. Where others learn resilience from failure, the insulated learn only invincibility. Where others sharpen humility from loss, the privileged sharpen denial. Barron had not been tempered by struggle. He had been protected from it. And when a person has never been forced to confront true opposition, their arrogance grows unchecked. This was the contrast that defined the moment. On one side stood Barron, insulated, dismissive, certain. That one word, unfit, could erase years of another person's work, sacrifice, and credibility. On the other stood Crockett, forged in fire, carrying the weight of lived experience and the resilience of someone who had been underestimated too many times to count. One had inherited a stage. The other had fought for every inch of it. Leadership, at its core, requires responsibility, an understanding that words carry weight, that power demands restraint, that truth matters more than theater. But Barron's performance revealed the opposite. It wasn't about responsibility. It was about spectacle. His attack on Crockett was not about debate, but about diminishing her, reminding the audience of his perceived superiority. It was arrogance, dressed as confidence, entitlement masquerading as authority. Still, in that moment, he believed himself untouchable. He leaned back with the certainty that history would echo his insult, not challenge it. He believed the cameras would frame Crockett as small, flustered, diminished. He believed that unfit would stick, not realizing that the word was about to boomerang with devastating force. Because arrogance always leaves a crack. It blinds its host to the possibility that others are prepared, that others are stronger, that others have weapons unseen. And Barron, cocooned by a lifetime of deference, could not imagine that Jasmine Crockett had come armed with more than composure. The insult that was supposed to define her would soon define him. And as the room leaned into silence, waiting for her reply, Barron's downfall had already begun, though he was the only one who couldn't see it. Jasmine Crockett did not step into politics because it was easy. She stepped in because she had lived the weight of unfairness, had seen up close how dignity could be stripped away from those who lacked money, influence, or the right last name. Before she ever sat beneath the blinding lights of a committee, hearing, she was a young woman raised in a world that told her at every turn that the deck was stacked against her. Her story was not written in gold-leaf towers or cushioned by private security. It was written in long nights, legal textbooks sprawled across a kitchen table, the hum of determination louder than fatigue. It was written in courtrooms where she defended those who could barely afford a lawyer, standing against prosecutors, who assumed her clients had already lost. It was written in quiet sacrifices, where dreams of comfort gave way to dreams of justice. Crockett's rise was not glamorous. It was gritty. She was underestimated at every rung of the ladder. Professors dismissed her as too ambitious. Colleagues whispered that she was too fiery. Opponents sneered that she didn't have the polish to survive the brutal theater of politics. But each underestimation was fuel. Each dismissal hardened her resolve. Where others saw flaws, she saw fire. Where others tried to silence her, she learned to sharpen her voice into something that could not be ignored. Her entry into public service was not a calculated career move. It was survival turned into mission. She saw families crushed by systems, designed to break them, immigrants tossed into shadows, women forced to fight twice as hard for half the recognition. She couldn't look away. She wouldn't look away. And so she fought. First in courtrooms, then in communities, then finally in the halls of Congress, carrying with her the weight of those who never had a microphone. By the time she earned her seat, Crockett had already fought more battles than most of her critics could imagine. She wasn't naive about what awaited her. She knew that Congress wasn't built to welcome women like her. It was built to test them, to grind them down, to see if they would bend or break. And yet, she entered with her head high. Not because the road was smooth, but because the scars she carried had already prepared her for every storm. Her resilience became her signature. When others spoke over her, she leaned in harder. When they tried to belittle her, she turned their words into ammunition. Her presence was proof that representation wasn't just symbolic, it was essential. Every time she sat at that polished committee table, she carried the echoes of the neighborhoods she came from, the voices of women who had been told to wait their turn, the stories of immigrants who had been told to go back. And so, when Barron Trump called her unfit, it was not the first time she had heard that word. She had heard it whispered in classrooms, spoken bluntly in offices, coded in headlines. Unfit was the word used by those too afraid to admit they feared her strength. It was the word used to clip wings before they could spread. But if life had taught Jasmine Crockett anything, it was this. Being called unfit was often the first sign that she was standing exactly where she needed to be. She had learned long ago that dignity was her sharpest weapon. Rage could be twisted, but dignity disarmed. Silence, held long enough, spoke louder than any shout. And behind her calm exterior, she always carried receipts, evidence, facts, truth that could slice through arrogance like glass. She never needed to shout to prove her worth. She needed only to wait for the right moment to let the truth speak for itself. And in this hearing, that moment had come. Barron Trump's insult was not new. It was the latest verse in a song she had heard her entire life. But this time, she was not just defending herself. She was standing for every woman told she wasn't strong enough, every immigrant told they weren't American enough, every underdog told they would never rise high. Enough. Her story was the opposite of privilege. It was the story of fighting uphill every single step, of being dismissed until she was undeniable. She knew what it meant to struggle. She knew what it meant to claw for space in rooms where others assumed you didn't belong. And now, as cameras zoomed in, she knew this was her moment to flip the script, because this wasn't the first time someone tried to silence her, but it would be the last time anyone underestimated her. The insult still hung in the air like smoke after a firecracker, bitter and undeniable. Unfit. One word, small enough to roll off the tongue with ease, yet heavy enough to try and crush everything Jasmine Crockett had built. Barron leaned back in his chair, lips curled into a self-satisfied smirk. For him, the battle was over before it began. He believed the cameras had already written the narrative, that history would remember him as the bold truth-teller who silenced his opponent with a single devastating strike. But Jasmine Crockett did not move. She did not flinch, did not lower her gaze, did not break into the angry retort Barron expected. Instead, she let the silence stretch. Every second of her composure grew heavier, pressing against the room. Staffers shifted uncomfortably. Spectators leaned forward, waiting for a reaction that didn't come. The longer she remained still, the more obvious it became. She wasn't shaken. She was calculating. Barron's smirk widened, mistaking her composure for surrender. He whispered something under his breath, loud enough for those nearby to catch. Another jab meant to draw her out. Still, Crockett refused to bite. Her eyes remained steady, fixed on him, but her face revealed nothing. And in that stillness, the balance of power began to shift. What Barron thought was dominance started to look like arrogance. What looked like silence began to feel like strength. The room itself seemed to react. A murmur ran through the audience, low at first, then sharper, as if the people themselves sensed the tension tilting. Journalists scribbled faster, their pens racing to capture a moment they knew could define the day. Camera operators zoomed in, lenses hungry for the twitch of Barron's smirk, the calm steel in Crockett's eyes. Everyone knew something was building. They just didn't know what. Crockett finally moved, not with the sudden outburst Barron anticipated, but with deliberate grace. She folded her hands, placed them on the table, and leaned in slightly. The chamber seemed to hold its breath. Barron's expression flickered for the first time, just for a second, as though he wondered whether his target had more fire than he anticipated. When Crockett finally spoke, her voice was measured, deliberate. She did not raise it, yet every syllable carried, echoing off the marble walls with clarity. Unfit, she repeated, as though testing the weight of the word herself. That's your judgment? The words weren't defensive. They were probing, surgical, meant to linger in the air like a challenge no one else dared to voice. Barron chuckled, shaking his head, waving a hand as though brushing her aside. That's not just my judgment, he said, confidence swelling. It's obvious. That was the moment the room's restlessness sharpened into unease. The arrogance in his tone, the smug certainty, it was too much, too blatant, too familiar. A few spectators frowned. A staffer shifted uncomfortably. Even the cameras, unblinking, seemed to capture the fragility behind his bravado. But Crockett didn't argue. She didn't scramble to prove herself or unleash a torrent of words in self-defense. Instead, she allowed his arrogance to echo, unchallenged, until the weight of it began to feel hollow. Then, slowly, she reached toward her side, her fingers brushing against something that had been resting there all along. For the first time, Barron's smirk faltered. His eyes darted toward her hand, then back to her face, as though suddenly, aware that her calm had not been surrender. It had been strategy. The audience leaned forward in unison, anticipation crackling like static in the air. And then, she reached for a recording device. The faint click of Jasmine Crockett's fingers, brushing the recording device, was louder than any outburst could have been. It was deliberate, almost ceremonial, the kind of movement that carried weight far beyond its simplicity. The entire chamber seemed to lean with her hand, following it as though the fate of the moment itself rested inside that small piece of technology. Barron Trump's smirk twitched. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. He had expected bluster, maybe a sharp retort he could easily dismiss. What he hadn't expected was this silence, this composure, this slow unveiling of something far more dangerous than anger. Evidence. Crockett lifted the device and set it on the table with care, letting the metallic tap against the wood echo across the chamber. It was a sound that cut through the room like a gavel. The whispers began immediately, staffers exchanging glances, journalists craning their necks, cameras zooming closer. Something was about to happen, and no one wanted to miss a single breath of it. She let the silence linger, her fingers poised just above the play button. Her eyes never left Barron. It wasn't a stare of rage. It wasn't even one of challenge. It was steady, almost pitying, as though she already knew how this would end. "Unfit," she said softly, her voice carrying in the hushed chamber. That word has been used for centuries to silence people who dared to rise beyond the boundaries others set for them. But sometimes, the truth speaks louder than arrogance, and with that, she pressed play. The device crackled to life, static filling the chamber for a heartbeat before a voice emerged. Clear, unmistakable. It was Barron's. His tone was sharp, arrogant, dripping with disdain. The recording captured him in a private conversation, mocking colleagues, belittling those he considered beneath him, laughing about using the word unfit as a political weapon rather than an honest judgment. The first sentence landed like a hammer. "Call them unfit, that shuts them down. Works every time." Gasps rippled through the audience, sharp and immediate. Cameras whipped back to Barron's face. His smirk had vanished, replaced by a stiffness that betrayed panic. He blinked rapidly, his jaw tightening as though he could will the words away. Crockett sat back, letting the recording continue. She didn't need to explain it. She didn't need to add commentary. The evidence spoke for itself. On the recording, Barron laughed, a cruel, hollow laugh. "People eat it up. Doesn't matter who they are, where they came from. Say they're unfit, and suddenly you're the authority. Doesn't matter if you've done worse yourself." The words hung heavy in the chamber. A murmur surged through. The crowd, louder now, tinged with outrage. Even those who might have supported him shifted uncomfortably, their faces betraying unease. This wasn't strategy anymore. It was exposure. Barron's hand twitched toward his microphone as if to interrupt, but then faltered. His confidence, once so unshakable, now cracked under the weight of his own voice echoing against him. He swallowed hard, glancing around, searching for support in faces that no longer mirrored his certainty. Crockett remained silent, letting the pause between each line of the recording draw out, each silence louder than the words themselves. The chamber had transformed into a theater, and Barron's unraveling was the performance everyone had come to see. Another line spilled out from the device. Doesn't matter if they're smarter, harder working, or more qualified. You control the narrative. Just say they don't belong. The crowd erupted again, this time not just with gasps, but with audible exclamations. Wow. Unbelievable. The collective outrage was palpable. Hashtags were already being born in real time on social media feeds. UNFIT backfire, receipt season, Crockett clapback. Barron leaned forward, his face flushed. This is taken out of context, he stammered, his voice shaking in a way it hadn't when he delivered his insult. But the damage was done. The once dominant figure now looked small, scrambling, exposed. Crockett didn't respond to his protests. She didn't need to. Instead, she let the final line of the recording deliver the blow. They'll never see it coming. They'll always be on the defensive. That's how you win. The device clicked off, the silence that followed louder than any applause. For a moment, no one moved. The chamber held its breath, the weight of the revelation pressing down like stone. Then Crockett leaned forward, her voice steady, calm, and devastatingly precise. Congressman Trump, you called me unfit. Yet here, in your own words, you admit the word is nothing but a weapon, a way to silence, to demean, to distract from truth. Today, that word doesn't belong to me. It belongs to you. The reaction was instant and overwhelming. The chamber erupted, not in chaos, but in a rolling wave of murmurs, gasps, even scattered applause from corners bold enough to break decorum. Journalists scribbled furiously. Cameras captured every frame of Barron's crumbling composure. His hand gripped the microphone as though it were a lifeline, but the words wouldn't come. He tried again, his voice faltering. This is fake. It's manipulated. But even as he spoke, the lack of conviction was obvious. His eyes darted, his hands shook, his once steady tone cracked under the pressure. The audience wasn't buying it. Crockett didn't need to say anything more. She simply sat back, her expression unchanging, as though to remind him that dignity didn't need to shout. Dignity simply needed to reveal. The power dynamic had flipped completely. Moments earlier, Barron had leaned back in arrogance, certain of his dominance. Now he leaned forward in desperation, his face flushed, his voice unsteady, his armor shattered by his own words. And for the viewers watching across the nation, the reversal was cinematic. The insult that was meant to define Jasmine Crockett had been turned into the very weapon that undid Barron Trump. The smirk that once carried power now looked hollow. The arrogance that once commanded fear now exposed as fragility. The room seemed to pulse with energy, every spectator aware they had just witnessed a political moment that would live far beyond the day's headlines. This was not just a rebuttal, it was a reckoning. And as Crockett folded her hands once more, letting silence settle like a final punctuation mark, one truth became undeniable. The insult had just been reversed with a single play. The chamber hadn't even emptied before the internet caught fire. Within minutes of Jasmine Crockett pressing play, the clip was everywhere, looped, remixed, slowed down for dramatic effect. The hashtags erupted like sparks to dry brush. UNFIT backfire, your receipt season, you Crockett clapback. Millions of people who hadn't watched a second of the hearing now replayed the exact moment Barron Trump's smirk faltered and his confidence cracked. Memes spread with the speed of wildfire. One showed Barron leaning smugly with the caption, "Unfit," side by side with a shot of Crockett hitting play, captioned, "Play stupid games, win stupid prizes." Another froze his panicked expression under the words, "When receipts show up to the party." TikTok creators layered dramatic music under the recording, turning it into a viral trend. Twitter became a rolling avalanche of reaction gifs and celebratory one-liners. But beyond the humor, something deeper stirred. Commentators who were usually cautious with their words came out swinging. Progressive voices hailed it as a defining moment, a masterclass in restraint and strategy. This wasn't just a clapback, one analyst on MSNBC declared. This was history. Crockett just showed the world how you dismantle arrogance with truth. Even figures outside the expected political lanes chimed in. Athletes, artists, even a few centrist commentators who often avoided controversy praised her for her composure and brilliance. One well-known conservative commentator admitted, almost begrudgingly, "Look, I may not agree with her politics, but the way she handled that's leadership. Barron got exposed." That admission alone sent shockwaves through the usual partisan lines. The narrative shifted fast. What had begun as Barron trying to brand Crockett as unfit turned into the nation watching him stumble under the weight of his own words. It wasn't just a clash of personalities anymore. It was a turning point in the ongoing story of who gets to define legitimacy in American politics. The word unfit, once wielded like a sword, now became a mirror reflecting the insecurities and manipulations of those who used it. And the ripple effects didn't stop at commentary. Organizers on the ground seized the moment. Activists began using the clip in speeches, tying it to broader struggles against dismissiveness and disrespect toward marginalized voices. Community leaders said it gave people a blueprint. Hold your ground, keep your dignity, and let the truth do the work. In classrooms, students shared it as an example of modern rhetoric. In barbershops and coffee houses, it sparked debates about power, arrogance, and the fragility of those who depend on insults to maintain control. What had been intended as a silencing tactic instead gave rise to one of the loudest conversations in recent political memory, and through it all, Barron Trump tried to recover. He went on friendly networks, attempted to discredit the recording, insisted it was out of context. But the problem was that context didn't matter anymore. The rawness of his voice, the laughter, the blatant strategy of demeaning others, it had all been heard, felt, and etched into the public consciousness. Every attempt to downplay it only made the clip circulate again, replayed with captions mocking his excuses. The power dynamic had shifted, not just in that room, but in the story America was telling itself. Once, the entitled could insult and dismiss without consequence, assuming their privilege would shield them. Now, Crockett had shown that privilege was not impenetrable. It could be cracked, exposed, and undone, and the world was watching. International outlets picked it up, framing it as a symbolic clash between old hierarchies and new voices. Commentators abroad marveled at how a single moment in a hearing room had become a referendum on power itself. But what mattered most wasn't the viral memes, the trending hashtags, or even the collapse of Barron's smug facade. Those were the fireworks, bright, dazzling, unforgettable. Yet the true legacy of the moment was quieter, deeper, and more enduring. Because in the echo of that recording, people realized something. They realized that insults can be reversed, arrogance can be exposed, and silence can be shattered with truth. They realized that a woman once underestimated could redefine what strength looks like in politics, and as the night settled and the hashtags continued to roll, one thought lingered. The clapback was unforgettable, but the lesson it left behind was even more powerful. When the noise of the viral moment began to soften, what lingered was not just the sting of Barron's insult or even the thunderclap of Crockett's counter. It was the clarity of the lesson she carried forward in her closing words. She didn't bask in the victory or linger in the humiliation of her opponent. Instead, she shifted the focus back to something larger, something enduring. Her voice, steady and unflinching, carried across the chamber as she spoke of dignity. Not just her own, but the dignity of every American who has ever been told they weren't good enough, who has been pushed aside, underestimated, or written off as unfit before they even had the chance to prove themselves. She reminded everyone watching that arrogance may roar in the moment, but dignity endures far longer. Crockett spoke about the countless times she had been underestimated, not just in politics, but in life. The quiet dismissals, the patronizing tones, the subtle reminders of who society believed had the right to power and who did not. And yet, she told the story not with bitterness, but with conviction. Because every dismissal had only sharpened her resolve. Every attempt to silence her had taught her to speak louder, not in volume, but in purpose. Her words expanded beyond the hearing room, reaching into living rooms, classrooms, workplaces. She framed the insult not as a personal slight, but as a mirror held up to the country. If arrogance and privilege are allowed to define who is worthy, then what does that say about the American promise? Her challenge was clear. America must choose whether it would allow arrogance to dictate its future, or whether it would reclaim the values of fairness, respect, and shared dignity. The beauty of her resolution was that it wasn't just defensive, it was aspirational. She didn't merely argue that she was fit for her position. She reminded the country that everyone deserves the chance to be measured by their contributions, not their lineage, their gender, or the color of their skin. She lifted the confrontation into something greater, a call to remember the nation's best self. The chamber, once tense with smirks and whispers, now seemed hushed with reflection. Even those who disagreed with her politically couldn't deny the integrity of her words. For a moment, the petty spectacle of insult politics was eclipsed by something rare, a vision of what America could be when it chose dignity over arrogance, truth over performance, respect over mockery, and outside that room, people felt it. On social media, yes, but also in the quiet ways that matter. Teachers replayed her words for students, parents used them as lessons at the dinner table, activists held them up as proof that calm conviction can defeat cruelty. The power wasn't just in what she had said to Barron Trump. It was in what she had said to the country. By the end, the insult that was meant to silence her had transformed into a lesson of resilience. The word unfit no longer belonged to her. It had boomeranged back on the arrogance that uttered it. In that reversal lay the moral of the moment. The true measure of fitness is not privilege or pedigree, but the courage to stand with dignity when it is most tested. As she left the chamber, Crockett's head was high, her stride steady. She hadn't just defended herself. She had defended the idea that every American, regardless of origin, has the right to claim respect. And in doing so, she planted a seed of belief that arrogance is temporary, but dignity, once claimed, can change everything. And yet, even as the nation applauded, one lingering thought remained. If this moment had shifted the conversation, what would come next? The lesson was powerful, but history had shown that arrogance rarely retreats quietly. And so, the stage was set for whatever battles lay ahead. So, when Barron Trump called Jasmine Crockett unfit, he believed the word would stick to her like a scar. Instead, it became the spark of her defining moment, the recording that flipped the narrative, silenced arrogance, and reminded America what true fitness of character looks like. The insult backfired, and what was meant as her undoing became her victory. But here's the truth. This story isn't just about Jasmine Crockett. It's about us. It's about every person who's ever been doubted, dismissed, or told they didn't belong. It's about refusing to accept the labels handed down by privilege and arrogance. And it's about remembering that the loudest voices aren't always the truest ones. That's why this channel exists, to bring you these moments, to dramatize them, to remind you that politics isn't just policy. It's a fight over dignity, respect, and the future of who gets to claim America as theirs. And in that fight, silence is not an option. If this story resonated with you, if you felt that flicker of pride, of validation, of belief in something bigger than the insult, then don't just watch. Be part of the movement. Subscribe now, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and join a community that refuses to let arrogance win. Every share, every comment, every voice added to this conversation is part of rewriting what America stands for. Because the next time someone is called unfit, the world will remember Jasmine Crockett's recording. And when it does, we'll be here, together, making sure dignity always has the final word.